You signed everything over, Mom, you have nothing left, my daughter said, her voice steady, almost rehearsed, as if she had been waiting for this moment for a long time, and I remember looking at her. Not with anger, not even with shock, but with a quiet clarity that settled in my chest like cold air on a winter morning, because in that instant I realized something she didn't expect. I understood exactly what she thought she had done, and more importantly, I understood what she had missed. The room around us felt too neat, too controlled, like a place that had already been stripped of anything personal, and Ashley stood near the kitchen counter with her arms folded, watching me the way someone watches a problem they've already decided is solved, and I nodded slowly, as if accepting her version of reality, as if I hadn't spent the last 40 years learning how people reveal themselves in the smallest of moments. If that's what you believe, I said quietly, my voice calm enough to make her shift slightly, just enough for me to notice, because Ashley had always been confident but never careful, and that was her first mistake. She thought this was about strength, about who could push harder, speak louder, take more. But I had learned a long time ago that the loudest person in the room is usually the one trying to cover something up, and I didn't need to raise my voice to see through her. I reached for my purse, still resting exactly where I had placed it when I walked in, and I could feel her watching me closely now, trying to read my reaction, waiting for tears, for pleading, for something that would confirm the story she had already written about me in her mind. But I gave her none of that, because this wasn't the moment to react, this was the moment to remember. To piece together the quiet inconsistencies that had been building for months, maybe longer, the things I had dismissed as stress or distance or the natural drift between a mother and her grown child. I walked toward the door, not rushed, not hesitant, just steady, the way you move when you already know where you're going, and behind me I heard her exhale, relief, I think, because to her this looked like surrender, like confirmation that she had won something, though I wasn't entirely sure what she thought the prize was. Outside, the air felt cooler than it should have for late spring, and for a moment I stood there on the front step, looking out at the quiet street, the same street I had driven down thousands of times over the years, picking Ashley up from school, carrying groceries inside, building a life that now felt strangely distant, like something I had watched instead of lived, and I let that feeling pass through me without holding on to it, because emotions, I've learned, can cloud the details, and right now the details were everything. I replayed her words in my mind, the certainty in her voice, the way she said I had nothing left, and I asked myself a simple question, not why would she do this, but how does she think this works, because something about it didn't fit, didn't align with what I knew about the paperwork, the accounts, the structure my husband and I had put in place years ago, long before Ashley ever showed interest in any of it, and that quiet question, that small crack in the surface of what she had just told me, was enough to shift everything. I walked down the steps and toward the curb, where a few neighbors glanced up briefly before returning to their routines, unaware that anything had changed, and in a way they were right. Nothing had changed yet, but I knew it would, because as I reached into my purse and felt the familiar edges of a folded document tucked safely inside, I allowed myself the smallest smile, not out of satisfaction, not yet, but out of certainty, because Ashley believed she had taken everything from me, and that belief was going to cost her more than she could imagine. I did not go far that day, not because I did not have anywhere to go, but because I needed to think, and thinking has always required space, not distance, so I sat in my car at the end of the block with the engine off, hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, watching the house in my rearview mirror as if it might reveal something new if I looked at it long enough. But houses do not tell the truth, people do. And Ashley had just told me everything I needed to know without realizing it. Her certainty was too clean, too final, like a script that had been practiced, and I began to trace it backward, step by step, asking myself when that tone first appeared, when her words stopped sounding like a daughter speaking to her mother and started sounding like someone managing a situation. It had not happened overnight, that much was clear. It had been gradual, subtle enough that I had explained it away at the time, the way she began handling the mail before I even saw it, the way she insisted on organizing the bills, saying it would be easier for me, the way she would pause just slightly when I asked about certain accounts, as if calculating how much to say and how much to hold back. And I remember one afternoon in particular about 6 months ago, when I had asked about the property tax notice that I used to handle every year, and she smiled and said, "It is already taken care of, Mom, you do not need to worry about that anymore." And at the time I had felt grateful, even relieved, because after my husband passed, there were days when even small tasks felt heavier than they should. But now, sitting there with that same house in my mirror, I understood that relief had been the first step in something else entirely, I reached into my purse again and unfolded the document just enough to feel the texture of the paper between my fingers without fully opening it. Because I did not need to read it yet, I already knew. What it said I had known for years, ever since my husband insisted we structure things in a way that would protect me, even from the people we loved, and I had questioned him back then, asked him why such precautions were necessary, and he had simply said, because kindness and entitlement can look the same at the beginning, and I had not fully understood him at the time, but I understood him now. I thought about the day Ashley offered for me to move in after the funeral, how she stood in this same driveway, her voice soft, her expression full of concern, telling me I should not be alone, that it would be easier if we were together, and I had believed her, not because I was naive but because I wanted to believe that the life I had built had created something solid in her, something that would hold when it mattered, and for a while it seemed like it had. She made space for me, adjusted routines, included me in conversations, but slowly, almost invisibly, those gestures shifted, invitations became notifications, conversations became updates, and I found myself being told about decisions instead of being asked, small at first, what to cook for dinner, when to schedule repairs, but then larger things, financial choices, paperwork, things that used to require my signature but somehow no longer did, and each time I hesitated, she would reassure me with that same steady tone, I have it handled. And I let her, because grief can make you trust convenience over caution. A car passed by slowly, and I watched it disappear at the corner, my reflection faint in the glass, older than I remembered, but clearer than I had felt in months, and I realized that what happened inside that house was not sudden at all. It was the final move in a sequence that had been building quietly, patiently, while I was still thinking in terms of family and she had already begun thinking in terms of control, and that difference, that gap in perspective, was exactly what she had relied on. I leaned back in my seat and closed my eyes for a moment, not to rest but to line everything up in my mind, the documents, the accounts, the timeline, the conversations, and with each piece the picture became sharper, more defined, until there was no doubt left, only a clear path forward. And when I opened my eyes again, the house no longer looked like something I had lost, it looked like something I had temporarily stepped away from, and there is a difference between those two things, a difference Ashley had not yet learned, but she would soon enough. I started the engine but did not pull away right away because there was one more thing I needed to confirm, not with Ashley, not with anyone else, but with myself, and that meant going back over the last conversation we had before everything shifted, the one that at the time felt ordinary, almost forgettable, but now stood out with a quiet sharpness. It was a Tuesday afternoon, I remember, because the sunlight came through the kitchen window at an angle that always made the countertop look warmer than it really was, and Ashley had been standing by the sink, scrolling through her phone, barely looking at me as I asked a simple question about one of the accounts my husband and I had always kept separate from the others, the one he used to call our just-in-case account, and she had paused just long enough for me to notice before saying, I think that one was consolidated, Mom. It made more sense to keep everything together. And I had nodded slowly, not because I agreed but because I recognized that word, consolidated. It was not a word Ashley used casually, it was something she had picked up recently, something she had practiced, and that was when I first felt it, not suspicion exactly, but a quiet awareness that I was no longer being included in decisions that directly affected me. At the time, I chose not to push, because pushing too early often closes doors you might need open later. But I did something else instead, something small that Ashley never noticed. I began to listen differently, not to what she said but to what she avoided, and over the next few weeks the pattern became clearer. She would answer quickly when the topic was general, but when it moved toward specifics, documents, signatures, timelines, her tone would shift, her sentences would shorten, and sometimes she would redirect the conversation entirely, offering to make tea, asking about something unrelated, anything to move us away from details, and I allowed it. Not because I was unaware, but because I needed to see how far she would go. I opened my eyes and looked again at the house, and this time I noticed something I had missed before. The curtains in the front window had been changed, a small detail, but one that told me more than it should have, because Ashley never cared about curtains. She cared about control, and changing something visible, something that marked the space as hers, was not about decoration, it was about ownership, about signaling a shift that had already taken place behind the scenes. I exhaled slowly and reached for my phone, not to call Ashley, but to scroll back through my messages, looking for timestamps, confirmations, anything that could anchor my memory to something concrete. And there it was, a message from 3 months ago where she asked me to sign a set of documents to simplify things. And I remembered that day clearly now, the way she placed the papers in front of me with a pen already uncapped, the way she stood just close enough to make the moment feel urgent. and how I had signed, but not before doing something she did not see. I had flipped through the pages just enough to catch a clause my husband had insisted on including in every major document, a clause that could not be overridden without a secondary authorization, something he had explained to me more than once patiently, making sure I understood not just what it said, but why it mattered. I let the phone rest in my lap and leaned back again, the pieces no longer scattered but aligning into something solid, something I could act on, and for the first time since Ashley's voice echoed in that kitchen, telling me I had nothing left, I felt something steady settle in my chest, not anger, not even disappointment but clarity, the kind that does not demand a reaction, only a decision, and I had already made mine. I shifted the car into drive and pulled away from the curb slowly, not looking back this time, because there was nothing in that house I needed to see again, not yet. What mattered now was what existed beyond it, the documents, the accounts, the system my husband had built with a level of foresight I had once thought unnecessary, and as the street disappeared behind me, I realized that Ashley had not taken control, she had only stepped into a position she did not fully understand, and that misunderstanding was not going to protect her, it was going to expose her piece by piece, until there was nothing left for her to stand on but the truth she had tried so carefully to avoid. I drove for about 15 minutes before I turned into a familiar parking lot, the kind of place that looks the same no matter how many years pass, quiet, predictable, almost invisible to anyone who does not need it, and that was exactly why my husband chose it all those years ago. The bank building sat at the corner, brick exterior, trimmed hedges, nothing about it suggesting that anything important happened inside, and as I parked beneath a tall oak tree, I noticed how steady my hands felt on the wheel, no shaking, no hesitation, just a calm that had not been there in months, and I realized it was because I was no longer guessing, I was confirming. I stepped out of the car and smoothed the front of my blouse out of habit, even though there was no one there to impress, and walked toward the entrance at an unhurried pace, each step measured, not because I was afraid, but because I understood that rushing often comes from uncertainty, and I did not feel uncertain anymore. Inside, the air was cool and quiet, the faint hum of fluorescent lights above blending with the soft sound of keyboards and distant conversation, and I recognized the layout immediately, though it had been years since I last visited in person, because some places stay exactly the way they were built to be, structured, reliable, unchanged by the shifting dynamics of a family. I approached the front desk and gave my name, Margaret Collins, watching the young man behind the counter type it in, his expression neutral at first, then slightly more attentive as the system pulled up the account profile, and he asked me to have a seat while he contacted a manager, which told me everything I needed to know before a single document was placed in front of me. I sat in the waiting area, folding my hands neatly in my lap, observing the room the way I used to when Ashley was a child and I needed to understand a situation without asking too many questions, and within a few minutes, a woman in her 40s approached me with a polite smile, introducing herself as Karen, and guided me into a private office with a glass door that closed softly behind us, sealing the space in a kind of quiet that demanded clarity. She asked how she could help, and I did not waste time with explanations. I simply stated that I needed to review the status of several accounts and any recent changes made to them, and I watched her carefully as she logged in because people often reveal more in their pauses than in their words, and there it was again, that same pause I had seen in Ashley weeks ago. Only this time it was followed by a slight tightening around the eyes, a professional attempt to remain composed while processing something unexpected. Karen turned the screen slightly toward me and began explaining the account structure, the consolidations, the transfers, all done under proper authorization, all appearing legitimate on the surface, and I nodded as she spoke, not interrupting, not reacting, because I already knew what she was going to find next. I just needed her to see it for herself. She scrolled further, clicking through layers of documentation, and then she stopped, her finger hovering just above the mouse as she leaned closer to the screen, reading something twice before speaking. "There is an additional clause attached to this account," she said slowly, her tone shifting just enough to confirm that we had reached the point I had been waiting for, and I allowed myself the smallest breath of acknowledgement, not visible, not audible, just enough to steady the moment. She read it aloud, the language precise, formal, exactly as my husband had insisted it be, outlining a secondary authorization requirement for any transfer exceeding a certain threshold, a requirement that could not be bypassed without direct verification from the primary holder, which was me, and I watched as the realization settled into her expression, not dramatic, not exaggerated, just a quiet understanding that something had been processed that should not have been finalized. These transactions, she began, then stopped, choosing her words carefully. They appear to have been initiated but not fully validated under this clause, and I met her eyes calmly because this was not a moment for accusation, it was a moment for correction. Then they are not complete, I said, my voice even, leaving no room for interpretation, and she nodded, already moving to pull up additional records, her posture shifting from explanation to resolution. In that small office, with the muted light reflecting off the glass door, the situation began to turn, not loudly, not visibly to anyone outside that room, but definitively, like a lock clicking into place. And as Karen continued to review the files, preparing the necessary steps to address what had been overlooked, I sat back in my chair and allowed the silence to settle around us, because everything Ashley believed she had secured was now resting on a detail she had never considered, and that detail was about to change everything. Karen did not rush, and that was something I appreciated more than she probably realized, because moments like this do not require speed, they require precision, and I watched as she navigated through each layer of documentation again, this time not to explain but to verify, her movements slower, more deliberate, as if she understood that what we were looking at was no longer routine. There are multiple transfers here, she said carefully, her eyes still on the screen. But each one exceeds the threshold that requires your direct confirmation. And I nodded once, not out of agreement but acknowledgement, because hearing it spoken aloud gave the situation a structure that could not be ignored. It was no longer something implied or suspected, it was something defined. She clicked into one of the larger transactions, the numbers clear and precise, and I recognized them immediately, not because I had seen the transaction before, but because I knew exactly which account it came from. The one my husband had always described as the foundation, the one we never touched unless it was absolutely necessary. And I felt a brief, almost distant memory surface, his voice explaining again why that account mattered, why it needed protection even from well-meaning hands, and I understood now that what he had anticipated was not malice but assumption, the quiet belief that access meant permission. Karen turned slightly toward me, her expression professional but no longer neutral. These transfers were processed as if the authorization was complete, she said, choosing each word with care. But the clause requires a secondary validation that is not reflected here, and I could see the question forming behind her eyes, not directed at me, but at the system itself, how something like this had moved forward without triggering a stop. I rested my hands lightly on the armrests of the chair and let her continue, because the answer was already there, not in the system, but in the way the process had been approached. Someone had followed the steps, but not the structure. They had seen the access and assumed it was enough. And that assumption had carried them through each stage without questioning the final requirement. Karen picked up the phone on her desk and spoke quietly to someone in another department, her tone shifting into something more formal, more procedural, and as she relayed the account details, I listened to the words she used: incomplete validation, authorization discrepancy, hold required, each phrase placing another piece into position, each one tightening the frame around what had happened. When she hung up, she looked back at me with a steadiness that matched my own. We are going to place an immediate hold on any further activity related to these accounts until this is fully reviewed, she said, and I inclined my head slightly, because that was the first step, not the final one but the necessary beginning. She continued, explaining that the transactions would be flagged for internal review, that the lack of proper validation would require correction, and that any funds moved under those conditions would be subject to reversal pending confirmation. And I listened without interruption, not because I needed the explanation, but because I wanted to hear how the system would respond when it recognized its own oversight. There was no urgency in my posture, no demand in my voice, because urgency belongs to those who are unsure of their position, and I was not unsure. I was simply allowing the process to unfold exactly as it was designed to when all variables were accounted for. Karen printed several documents and placed them neatly in front of me, indicating where I needed to review and confirm my identity as the primary holder, and I read each page carefully, not skimming, not assuming, because attention to detail is what separates control from confusion, and when I signed, I did so with the same steady hand I had used years ago, only this time with a clearer understanding of what that signature protected. As she gathered the papers and organized them into a file, she paused briefly, then said, "Once this is processed, the current account status will be restored to its last fully authorized state." And there it was, stated plainly, the shift that had already begun. Not dramatic, not visible from the outside, but decisive. I stood, slowly smoothing my blouse again out of habit, and thanked her with a simple nod, because there was no need for more. The work was already in motion, and as I walked out of the office and back through the quiet bank lobby, I felt that same steady clarity settle deeper, not as a reaction to what had happened, but as a recognition of what was now inevitable, because everything Ashley believed she had secured depended on a foundation she did not fully understand, and that foundation was already correcting itself. I did not drive home after leaving the bank because I no longer thought of that house as home, not in the way I once had, and instead I turned onto a quieter road that led toward a small office building I had not visited in years, one that sat between a law firm and a tax consultant, the kind of place most people pass without noticing, but I remembered it clearly because it was where my husband and I had sat together one afternoon, reviewing documents that at the time felt excessive, almost unnecessary, and now felt like the most important decision we had ever made. I parked in the same spot I had used back then, near the side entrance where the shade kept the car cooler, and for a moment I remained still, letting the weight of the past settle into the present, not as regret but as recognition, because everything I was about to do had already been set in motion years ago. I was simply stepping back into a role I had momentarily stepped away from. Inside, the office was smaller than I remembered, or perhaps I simply saw it more clearly now. The framed certificates on the wall, the neatly arranged folders behind the desk, everything in its place, and I gave my name at the front, watching as the receptionist checked her schedule before offering a polite nod and asking me to wait. And as I sat there, I thought about how different this moment felt compared to the bank, not because the stakes were higher, but because this was where the structure had been built, not just enforced. When the attorney stepped out to greet me, his expression shifted almost immediately from routine professionalism to recognition, and he said my name with a familiarity that told me he remembered more than just a file, and as he led me into his office I could see it in the way he moved, the way he already understood that this was not a casual visit. I took a seat across from his desk and placed my purse beside me, not opening it yet because I wanted to hear what he would say first, and he did not disappoint. "It has been a long time, Mrs. Collins," he said, his tone measured. "But I remember your husband very clearly." And I inclined my head slightly, acknowledging the memory without letting it take over the moment, because this was not about looking back, it was about confirming what still stood. I explained the situation briefly, not with emotion, but with facts, the transfers, the lack of proper validation, the clause that had been triggered, and I watched as he listened without interruption, his expression calm, analytical, as if he were already mapping out the implications before I finished speaking. And when I mentioned Ashley's assumption that everything had been secured, he allowed himself the faintest pause before responding, not with surprise, but with something closer to quiet understanding. He reached into a drawer and pulled out a file, one I recognized immediately by the label, even before he opened it, and as he placed it on the desk between us, I felt a sense of alignment settle into place, the past and present connecting in a way that removed any remaining uncertainty. He opened the file and turned it toward me, pointing to a section I had seen before but never truly needed to rely on, a provision that outlined not just financial protection, but conditional authority, a structure designed to prevent exactly what had just occurred, and as he explained it again in clear, precise language, I realized how carefully everything had been constructed, not to control, but to ensure that control could not be taken without consequence. "If what you are describing is accurate," he said, his voice steady, "then any actions taken without full compliance with these terms are subject to reversal, and more importantly, they establish a pattern that can be addressed formally." And I met his gaze without hesitation, because this was not a question of if, but of how far it would go. We reviewed the necessary steps, the documentation required, the timeline for response, each detail laid out with the same precision my husband had valued, and I did not rush through any of it, because clarity comes from understanding, not speed. And when everything had been outlined, I finally opened my purse and removed the folded document I had carried with me, placing it on the desk between us, and as he unfolded it and read, his expression remained composed, but there was a subtle shift, a recognition that what we had in front of us was not just a situation, but a position, one that had been prepared long before Ashley ever believed she had the upper hand. I closed my hands gently in my lap and allowed the silence to settle for a moment, because there was nothing left to question, only action to take, and as I stood to leave, With the next steps clearly defined and already in motion, I understood something with complete certainty. This was never about taking anything back, it was about restoring what had never truly been lost, and that restoration had already begun. I did not rush the next step because rushing would have changed the nature of what I was doing, and this was no longer about reacting, it was about positioning, so instead of driving anywhere immediately, I returned to the same street I had left earlier, parking a short distance away where I could see the house without being seen, and I sat there again just as I had before, only this time I was not searching for answers, I was observing outcomes. The front of the house looked unchanged, the same curtains, the same driveway, the same quiet stillness that hides everything happening behind closed doors, and I wondered briefly what Ashley was doing at that exact moment, whether she felt secure, whether she believed the situation was already resolved, because people who think they have won tend to relax, and in that relaxation they reveal more than they realize. I checked the time on the dashboard, noting it carefully because timing matters more than emotion in situations like this, and I knew from the attorney and the bank that certain actions would already be underway, not visible, not announced, but moving through the systems that Ashley had trusted without fully understanding, and I imagined her going about her afternoon, perhaps checking an account, perhaps making a call, perhaps planning something that depended on resources she believed were already hers, and that thought did not bring satisfaction, it brought clarity, because it reminded me that this was not about confrontation, it was about alignment, allowing the truth to meet the assumption at exactly the right moment. A car pulled into the driveway and I recognized it immediately, Ashley's, the same one she had bought last year, the one she had proudly told me was a smart investment, and I watched as she stepped out, her posture confident, her movements unhurried, as if nothing had shifted, as if the structure beneath her had not already begun to change, and she walked inside without looking around, without noticing the small details that I had trained myself to see. The slight delay in the garage door closing, the way she checked her phone before even reaching the front door, habits that spoke more about her state of mind than any words could. I did not follow, I did not approach, because presence would have altered the sequence, and this sequence needed to unfold without interference, so I remained where I was, letting the minutes pass, watching the quiet rhythm of the street, and then after some time, I saw it, not dramatic, not loud, but unmistakable. The shift in her movement when she stepped back outside, her pace faster now, her posture tighter, her phone already in her hand, her expression no longer composed but focused in a way that suggested something had changed, something she had not expected. She stood near the car, tapping at her screen, then stopping, then tapping again, as if trying to refresh something that was not responding the way it should. And even from a distance I could see the pattern, the small signs of confusion that come when a system no longer confirms your assumptions, and I knew what she was seeing, or rather what she was not seeing, access that no longer aligned, balances that no longer appeared as they had, restrictions that had quietly taken hold. She made a call, pacing slightly now, her free hand moving in short, sharp gestures, the kind that signal urgency rather than control, and I watched without judgment, without satisfaction, simply noting the progression, because this was the moment where belief begins to fracture, where certainty gives way to questions and questions lead to realization. I did not need to hear the conversation to understand it. The tone, the pauses, the repeated attempts, all of it followed a pattern I had seen before in different contexts. People confronting a situation they thought they understood only to discover that there was more beneath the surface, something they had overlooked, something that now defined the outcome. After a few minutes she stopped moving, standing still beside the car, staring at her phone in a way that was no longer active but processing, and that stillness told me more than anything else could, because it meant the first layer of realization had settled in, not fully, not completely, but enough to shift her perspective. I turned the key in the ignition and let the engine start quietly, not because I needed to leave immediately, but because I understood that my role in this moment was complete. I had seen what I needed to see, the beginning of the transition from assumption to awareness, and as I pulled away from the curb I did not look back, not out of avoidance, but because there was nothing behind me that required my attention anymore. Everything that mattered was already in motion, and the outcome was no longer a question, it was a matter of time. I let the next day arrive without interference because timing is not something you force, it is something you allow, and when morning light filtered through the window of the small hotel room I had checked into the night before, I sat quietly with a cup of coffee in my hands, not watching the clock, not waiting for a call, but knowing that the process we had set in motion would reach its next stage without needing my presence. The room was simple, clean, nothing personal, and I found a certain clarity in that, because there were no memories attached to it. No history to distract me, only the present moment and the quiet certainty that comes when everything has been aligned properly. I set the cup down and reached for my phone, not out of urgency but habit, and there it was, a missed call, then another, both from Ashley, spaced just minutes apart, followed by a message that was longer than anything she had sent me in months, the kind of message people write when they are trying to understand something they cannot control, and I did not open it immediately, because reading it would not change what had already begun, and I preferred to let her move through her own realization before I stepped back into the conversation. I stood by the window and looked out at the parking lot below, cars coming and going in quiet routine, and I thought about how different this morning felt compared to the day before, not because anything visible had changed, but because the uncertainty was gone, replaced by a steady progression of cause and effect, each step unfolding exactly as it should. When I finally opened the message, I read it slowly, not skimming, not reacting, just taking in the words as they were written, questions layered with confusion, references to accounts she could no longer access, transactions that appeared to be reversed or placed on hold, and a tone that shifted from confidence to something more uncertain, more searching, as if she was trying to piece together a structure she had assumed was already complete. She asked if I knew anything about what was happening, if I had spoken to the bank, if there was some kind of mistake, and I noticed what she did not say. She did not mention the clause, she did not reference the condition that had triggered everything, because she had never truly seen it, never understood that it existed as more than just words on a page. I set the phone down again without replying, not out of avoidance, but because this was not the moment for explanation. This was the moment for the system to finish what it had started, and explanation would come later, when the facts were no longer in question. A second message appeared shortly after, shorter this time, more direct, asking me to call her, and I could almost hear the shift in her voice through the words, the absence of certainty, the beginning of something else, something that had not been there the day before when she stood in the kitchen and told me I had nothing left. I picked up the phone and held it for a moment, considering, not whether to respond, but how, because tone matters, timing matters, and most of all, position matters, and I was no longer in the position she believed I was in. I dialed her number and listened. As it rang once, twice, then connected, and when she answered, her voice was not the same as it had been, the steadiness replaced by something tighter, controlled but strained, and she began speaking immediately, explaining what she was seeing, what was not working, what did not make sense, and I let her speak without interruption. Because people reveal the most when they are trying to regain control of a situation they no longer understand. When she finished, there was a brief silence, the kind that holds more weight than any words, and I spoke calmly, not raising my voice, not adding emotion, simply stating what needed to be said. Nothing is missing, Ashley, I said, my tone even. It is just no longer where you thought it was. And I could feel the shift on the other end of the line, not immediate understanding, but the beginning of it, the moment when assumption starts to give way to reality. She asked what I meant, her voice sharper now, trying to re-establish control through clarity, and I did not give her more than she needed, not yet. You should review the documents again, I said, carefully this time, and I left it there because the answer was already in her hands. It always had been, she had simply chosen not to see it. When I ended the call, I set the phone down beside me and returned to the window, the same quiet parking lot below, the same steady rhythm of movement, and I allowed myself a single measured breath, not of relief, not of victory, but of completion, because the process had reached its turning point, the moment where everything that had been assumed was now being corrected, and from this point forward, there would be no confusion, only consequence. I did not return to the house immediately, because returning too soon would have shifted the balance back into something emotional, and this was no longer about emotion, it was about resolution, so I waited one more day, allowing everything to settle into its proper place, allowing Ashley to move from confusion into understanding, because only then would the truth carry its full weight. When I finally drove back, the street looked exactly the same, quiet, unchanged, as if nothing had happened. But I knew better, because what had changed was not visible from the outside, it was structural, and structure is what defines outcome. I parked in the driveway this time, not down the street, not at a distance, but directly in front of the house, and I stepped out of the car with the same steady pace I had carried through every step of this process, not rushed, not hesitant, just certain, and as I walked up to the front door, I noticed it was slightly ajar, not open but not fully closed. Either, a small detail that spoke more than any words could, because it told me Ashley had been pacing, moving in and out, unable to settle, unable to return to the certainty she once had. I pushed the door open gently and stepped inside, the familiar scent of the house still there, but altered somehow, as if the space itself had shifted along with everything else, and I saw her immediately, standing in the living room, her phone in her hand, her posture rigid, as if she had been waiting not for me specifically, but for something to resolve, something to make sense again. When she looked at me, there was no anger in her expression, not the kind she had shown before. What I saw instead was something quieter, something closer to realization, and she took a step forward, her voice lower than it had been the day before. "What did you do?" she asked, not accusing, not demanding but searching, and I set my purse down on the table beside the door before answering, not because I needed time, but because actions matter as much as words, and I wanted this moment to be grounded, not reactive. "I did not take anything from you," I said calmly, meeting her gaze without hesitation. "I only confirmed what was already mine." And I watched as the meaning settled into her, not all at once but in layers, each piece connecting to something she had overlooked, something she had assumed did not matter. She shook her head slightly, as if trying to reject the explanation, but her voice did not follow that resistance. "The accounts, they are frozen, the transfers are gone." They said something about authorization. And there it was, the language of the system replacing the certainty she once had, and I nodded once, acknowledging the truth without adding anything unnecessary, because this was not a moment for explanation, it was a moment for recognition. She moved closer, her steps slower now, more deliberate, and I could see the shift fully in her posture, the confidence replaced by something more measured, more aware, and she asked again, quieter this time, "How?" And I held her gaze, not with judgment, not with anger, but with clarity, because this was the part she needed to understand, not just what happened but why. "Because you assumed access meant control," I said evenly, "and it does not." And I let the words settle between us, not adding more, because anything beyond that would have diluted the truth rather than strengthened it. She looked down for a moment, her grip tightening slightly on the phone, and I could see the realization fully now, not dramatic, not overwhelming but complete, the kind that changes how a person sees everything that came before it. And when she looked back up, there was no argument left, only the quiet weight of understanding. I walked past her then, not brushing against her, not forcing movement, just continuing forward into the house, and I noticed the small changes she had made, the curtains, the arrangement of furniture, the subtle way she had tried to reshape the space, and none of it mattered anymore, because the structure beneath it had already been restored. I moved toward the hallway where my belongings had once been, and I knew without needing to check that everything would be returned, not because she wanted to, but because she understood that she had no position left to hold it otherwise. And as I stood there in the same place I had once been told I had nothing left, I felt that same steady clarity settle into its final form, not as a reaction, not as a victory, but as a conclusion, because this was never about proving her wrong, it was about allowing the truth to stand on its own, and now that it had, there was nothing left to argue, nothing left to take back. Only the quiet certainty that what was mine had never truly been hers to control.